Steven Seagal walked onto the plane with his usual calm and confident demeanor. He had a long day behind him and was looking forward to relaxing in first class. The cabin was buzzing with activity, flight attendants checking passengers, people settling in, and the soft hum of the engines warming up. He approached the first-class section without a word, expecting the simple courtesy of a seat he had booked months in advance. But as he reached the counter, a young flight attendant stepped in front of him. She crossed her arms and smirked. "Sorry, sir," she said with a tone dripping in condescension. "First class is full." Seagal paused, his expression unreadable. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't try to argue. He simply looked at her calmly, a faint smile playing on his lips. Around them, passengers noticed the interaction, some whispering and turning their heads. I have a reservation," Seagal said softly, producing his ticket and ID. The attendant barely glanced at it. "We don't have your name here," she replied, almost laughing. "You'll have to sit in coach. It's just, first class is for people who actually belong here." The words hung in the air like a sudden chill. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the tension. A few discreetly pulled out their phones to record what was unfolding. Seagal nodded slowly as if she had said nothing of importance. He didn't push back, didn't raise his voice, and didn't show any sign of anger. Instead, he turned and walked toward the coach section, every step measured and calm. His presence alone commanded attention. People whispered to each other. Who was this man? He carried himself like someone used to being in control. The flight attendant returned to her duties, satisfied with what she thought was a victory. Around her, staff exchanged knowing glances, thinking the situation was over. But what they didn't realize was that they had just underestimated the person in front of them. The man they had dismissed as just another passenger was far more than he appeared. As Steven settled into his seat in the back, a strange stillness seemed to settle over the cabin. The whispers grew, eyes followed him, and a few passengers exchanged puzzled glances. Something about him didn't fit the image of someone who would quietly accept humiliation. Something told everyone that the events about to unfold would be unforgettable. This was not just a flight. For the airline staff, it was the beginning of a moment they would never forget. It was a busy morning at Sky High Airlines, the kind of morning where the airport seemed alive with movement and noise. The terminal buzzed with travelers dragging luggage, checking flight information on glowing screens, and queuing at counters. Flight announcements echoed through the halls. The staff hustled from gate to gate, ensuring boarding went smoothly. For most people, it was just another routine day, a typical flight filled with mundane moments. But for those working this particular flight, the day was about to become anything but ordinary. The crew, confident in their usual procedures, were going about their work with a sense of authority. They smiled at passengers, scanned tickets with practiced efficiency, and occasionally exchanged quick jokes with each other. Everything seemed perfectly normal. Until he arrived. Steven Seagal walked through the boarding gate with quiet composure. There were no bodyguards, no entourage, no flashy display. Just a man in his late 60s wearing simple jeans, a worn jacket, and sunglasses. He carried himself with an air of calm confidence, as though the world belonged to him, but he didn't need to prove it. As soon as he approached the first-class counter, one flight attendant, young and brimming with a misplaced sense of power, noticed him and smirked. "No first class for you, sir," she said, her voice filled with arrogance and a hint of mockery. Her words were sharp, cutting through the usual boarding chatter. Some passengers nearby paused, their eyes flicking toward the interaction. A few whispered to each other, sensing that something unusual was happening. Steven Seagal did not respond immediately. He simply looked at her, calm and unshaken, the faintest smile on his face. There was no anger. No confrontation. Just a quiet, measured presence that seemed to pull attention toward him naturally. I have a reservation," Steven said softly, producing his ticket and ID. He placed them on the counter, his hands steady. His voice was calm, controlled, yet carried an unspoken authority that made the words resonate more than he intended. The flight attendant barely glanced at the documents. "We don't have your name here," she replied, the smirk widening. "You'll have to sit in coach. First class is for people who actually belong here." The words hit the surrounding passengers like a sudden gust of wind. A few gasps could be heard, and murmurs spread through the first-class line. Some people exchanged glances, eyes wide, as if witnessing something they couldn't believe. A few discreetly pulled out their phones, recording the moment, sensing that they were about to see something extraordinary. Steven nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging her words but not allowing them to disturb his composure. He turned and began walking toward the coach section. Each step was deliberate, calm, and commanding. His presence alone seemed to ripple through the cabin, making passengers aware that this was no ordinary man. The young flight attendant, feeling victorious, returned to her other duties. She laughed quietly, exchanging knowing glances with a colleague who seemed to share her satisfaction. In their minds, the situation was over. They believed they had asserted authority over a passenger who dared to challenge the rules, unaware that they had made a critical miscalculation. As Steven settled into his seat in coach, the cabin around him seemed to quiet. People stared, some whispering, some shaking their heads in disbelief. There was an unusual tension in the air, subtle but undeniable. He did not make a scene, did not raise his voice, did not demand attention. Yet the way he sat, calm and composed, drew the gaze of everyone around him. Passengers could sense that he was observing, taking in details, and silently assessing the people who had dared to deny him the respect he was owed. A few passengers leaned toward each other, whispering nervously. "Is that Steven Seagal?" one asked. Another passenger shook their head, incredulous. "It can't be, right?" But the aura around him, the quiet confidence and the steady gaze, said otherwise. Even the other flight attendants started to notice. They exchanged glances, feeling a subtle shift in the energy of the cabin. Something had changed, though no one could quite put their finger on it yet. It was as if the entire plane had fallen into a delicate balance, waiting for the next move. Steven remained quiet, focused, and composed as if nothing had happened. But in reality his mind was already moving. He had been insulted, underestimated, and dismissed. Yet he did not react with anger. He did not yell or demand his rights in the moment. Instead, he simply observed, waiting for the perfect moment to remind everyone that actions have consequences and arrogance can blind even those who think they are in control. Before we continue, tell me in the comments, have you ever been denied something you deserved? Share your story. The boarding continued, passengers took their seats, and the plane began to prepare for takeoff. But for Steven Seagal and the crew who had underestimated him, this was only the beginning. The calm before the storm had arrived, and no one on board knew how unforgettable the next 30 minutes would become. The flight finally took off, engines roaring to life as the plane lifted from the runway. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, and the initial turbulence was nothing compared to the tension already brewing inside. Passengers settled into their seats, some flipping through magazines, others peering out the windows. But amidst the normal chaos of a busy flight, one man remained an island of calm. Steven Seagal leaned back in his coach seat, eyes scanning the cabin briefly before returning to the small book he had pulled from his bag. Every so often he would glance up, observing the first-class section with quiet precision. The staff there whispered among themselves, barely containing their laughter. They exchanged jokes at his expense, their voices low but sharp enough for nearby passengers to overhear. "Did you see him? He actually bought a ticket and thinks he belongs here," one flight attendant whispered. Another laughed quietly, shaking her head. They had no idea who they were mocking. To them, Steven Seagal was just another passenger, perhaps a celebrity from old movies, nothing threatening, nothing consequential. The arrogance of their laughter filled the cabin with a false sense of superiority. They were so caught up in their little victory that they failed to notice the air around him subtly changing, a calm tension building that no one could explain. Steven closed his eyes for a moment, resting his hands over the book in his lap. But make no mistake, his mind was far from idle. Inside he was calculating, analyzing, remembering. Every slight, every smirk, every word of mockery was catalogued with precision. He was not angry in the way most would be, there was no shout, no outburst, but a quiet, simmering determination had begun to take shape. The crew's whispers grew louder, bouncing off the walls of the cabin, but he didn't flinch. He had seen arrogance before, and he knew it would always reveal itself when challenged properly. The humor they thought they were sharing was only digging them deeper into a situation they couldn't possibly control. Around him, passengers began to notice the strange dynamic. Some shifted in their seats, sensing tension they couldn't yet name. A young mother clutched her child's hand a little tighter. A businessman on his phone paused mid-call, his curiosity piqued by the odd energy in the cabin. Even the pilot, seated in the cockpit, seemed unaware that the first-class crew's arrogance was about to trigger a chain of events they would regret. Steven opened his eyes briefly, his gaze calm but piercing. There was no malice, no anger, only focus. His demeanor radiated a quiet power that contrasted sharply with the giggling, oblivious crew. He leaned slightly forward, marking his place in the book before leaning back again, blending seamlessly into the background while plotting a lesson they would never forget. Minutes passed, each one heavier than the last. The staff in first class continued their quiet jokes, congratulating each other for what they believed was a clever move. "Can you believe he just went to coach without a fight?" one said, nudging a colleague. They had no idea that this very act of calm defiance was more powerful than any confrontation could have been. Steven shifted slightly in his seat, letting the murmurs wash over him. He observed their body language, noting who was overconfident, who was insecure, and who would be the easiest to influence once the time came. He didn't need to say a word. Every movement, every gesture, was a silent message, a promise that patience and strategy often speak louder than shouting or anger. The whispers among the crew grew slightly tense as they sensed, even if only subconsciously, that their victory was hollow. The passengers began to notice the odd silence that occasionally fell over Steven's section. He would glance up, eyes briefly meeting theirs, and a shiver of curiosity would run through them. Something was coming, though no one could yet define it. As the flight progressed, the tension in the cabin became almost palpable. Steven sat quietly, reading, observing, waiting. The crew's laughter had started to falter, replaced by subtle glances and half-formed doubts. They had dismissed him, underestimated him, and in doing so, they had invited the consequences that were quietly brewing in the back of the cabin. No one spoke. No one dared challenge him. He was calm, composed, patient. And inside, a plan was forming, a plan that would make the arrogance of the first-class crew their undoing. In a matter of minutes, the smug confidence that had filled the cabin would be replaced by shock, awe, and a lesson they would never forget. The passengers leaned forward slightly, sensing something extraordinary was about to unfold. Phones were subtly raised to record, whispers filled the air, and even the pilot seemed to notice a tension he could not explain. Steven Seagal remained seated, calm but calculating, quietly preparing for the moment when the arrogance around him would meet the consequences it had long ignored. As the plane climbed higher into the sky, an unusual tension settled over the cabin. For most passengers, it was just another flight, a routine journey from one city to the next. But for those seated near the first-class section, something felt off. The atmosphere had shifted. There was a subtle energy in the air, a quiet buzz that was hard to ignore. Some passengers noticed it immediately. A businessman in a crisp suit leaned back in his seat, narrowing his eyes toward the front. His hand hovered over his tablet, but his attention had shifted entirely to the unfolding situation. A young woman clutched her handbag a little tighter, glancing nervously at the first-class crew, sensing the unusual dynamic. Even a child playing with a tablet looked up briefly, as if sensing the strange energy that seemed to hum in the cabin. Several passengers discreetly pulled out their phones, quietly recording. They weren't sure what was happening, but they knew it was important. Something in the way Steven Seagal carried himself, calm and composed, drew attention. There was a quiet authority about him, a presence that seemed to demand respect even when it wasn't demanded verbally. Meanwhile, the flight attendant who had initially denied him first-class access strutted through the cabin, her confidence seemingly growing with every step. She laughed quietly with a colleague, showing off her perceived control over the situation. "Can you believe he just went to coach without a fight?" she whispered, clearly proud of herself. She moved with the air of someone who believed the world revolved around her judgment, unaware that she was in the presence of someone far more powerful than she realized. Steven didn't react. He didn't look up from his seat, didn't raise his voice, and didn't engage. He simply observed. Every step, every laugh, every gesture was catalogued with precision. He noted who was arrogant, who was overconfident, and who might crack under pressure. His eyes, calm and steady, scanned the room in quiet assessment. Each whisper, each smirk, each glance exchanged among the first-class staff was recorded in his mind. Passengers began to murmur among themselves. "Who is that?" one whispered. "Isn't that Steven Seagal?" another replied, voice trembling slightly with awe. The whispers grew, spreading from row to row. People leaned forward, straining to get a better look, their curiosity piqued. Phones were raised to discreetly capture video, though most were unsure what exactly they were witnessing. There was a collective sense that something extraordinary was unfolding, though the full scope was not yet clear. The young flight attendant continued her antics, oblivious to the growing unease around her. She moved back and forth, laughing quietly, adjusting her uniform, speaking with other staff as though she were the center of the universe. Her confidence was palpable, but so was its fragility. It was clear that no one had yet challenged her sense of control, but that challenge was coming. Steven shifted slightly in his seat, leaning back as if nothing had changed. To any casual observer, he appeared completely relaxed, almost bored. But in reality he was calculating, waiting for the precise moment to act. Every glance, every whisper, every smirk from the crew in first class was part of a puzzle he was solving in real time. He was preparing a lesson, a quiet but undeniable reminder that arrogance and disrespect carry consequences. Around him, passengers felt the air thicken with anticipation. Some exchanged nervous glances, others whispered quietly to themselves, all trying to make sense of the strange energy that had entered the cabin. Even the more experienced travelers, those who had flown hundreds of times, felt a subtle anxiety in the air. Something was coming, though no one could yet name it. The cabin fell into an almost imperceptible rhythm. The whir of the engines and the faint hum of the air conditioning became a background to the growing tension. Steven sat quietly, his presence almost magnetic. Passengers couldn't help but watch him, sensing that he was in control even though he hadn't said a word. The crew, on the other hand, remained unaware that the situation had already begun to slip from their control. As the plane cruised at altitude, the sense of anticipation grew. Passengers shifted in their seats, murmuring and glancing toward first class. Cameras discreetly recorded every movement. Every laugh from the crew, every step of the flight attendant, was being catalogued by someone. And all the while, Steven remained calm, eyes scanning, mind calculating. The whispers became a low hum of curiosity throughout the cabin. Something was about to happen. Everyone could feel it, even the crew who thought they were in command. Something unseen but powerful was brewing, and when it struck, the arrogance and disrespect that had filled the first-class section would collide with consequences they could not have imagined. Steven's presence alone was enough to shift the energy in the cabin. No one spoke to him directly, but the atmosphere had changed. Passengers leaned forward, hearts beating a little faster, some gripping armrests. Everyone knew, without knowing exactly why, that the story unfolding before them would be unforgettable. Halfway through the flight, the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted from subtle tension to an almost tangible anticipation. Passengers in every section were beginning to sense that something significant was about to happen. Phones were discreetly raised, recording snippets of a story they could not yet fully understand. Whispered conversations floated through the aisles, but no one could predict the scale of the moment that was about to unfold. Steven Seagal remained seated, calm and composed, for much of the first half of the flight. But then, as the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, he slowly rose from his seat. There was no urgency in his movements, no dramatic gestures. He simply stood, his presence immediately drawing the eyes of nearby passengers. Conversations faded, whispers ceased, and a hush fell over the cabin. Every gaze turned toward him. He pulled out his phone and made a call. The voice on the other end was inaudible to anyone on the plane, but his tone was calm, measured, and commanding. Even from the back of the cabin, passengers could sense that this was not an ordinary call. Something important, something irreversible, had just been set into motion. Within minutes, the sound of footsteps approaching the front of the plane drew everyone's attention. Airline executives, dressed in crisp suits and carrying folders and documents, hurried down the aisle. Their expressions were a mixture of urgency, confusion, and respect. They moved quickly but carefully, aware that the man they were approaching was not just a passenger but someone of immense authority. The first-class staff froze. The flight attendant who had denied Steven his seat barely had time to register the approaching executives before her world began to unravel. Her colleagues exchanged nervous glances, suddenly realizing that the arrogance they had displayed was about to have immediate consequences. Some attempted to straighten uniforms or adjust posture, as if that could somehow save them. It couldn't. "Mr. Seagal, what should we do?" one executive asked, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. The cabin went silent. Passengers watched, holding their breath. Cameras discreetly recorded every movement. The first-class crew could no longer hide their fear, their confidence replaced with confusion and panic. Steven looked at the executives calmly, his expression unchanging. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He simply said, "You treated me poorly. That ends now." The words were clear, precise, and final. For a moment there was complete silence. The first-class staff stared at him, mouths slightly open, unable to comprehend how the situation had escalated so quickly. They had laughed at him, belittled him, and assumed their authority was unchallengeable. Now, that authority had evaporated in the face of someone they had underestimated. Passengers whispered in awe, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Phones clicked and recorded, capturing the moment history seemed to unfold before their eyes. Even those seated further back could feel the energy shift. Steven Seagal was no longer just a passenger. He was the embodiment of power and quiet authority, teaching a lesson that needed no shouting, no aggression, only presence and decisiveness. The executives quickly began addressing the situation. Staff members were called one by one, their earlier arrogance replaced by a nervous awareness that their actions had consequences. Apologies were stammered, explanations fumbling, but it was clear that the balance of power had completely shifted. Passengers exchanged glances. Some were stunned. Some smiled, recognizing the rare display of justice being served mid-flight. Others whispered in excitement, knowing they were witnessing a story they would recount for years. Steven remained calm throughout, surveying the cabin, his presence a silent reminder of respect and humility. Every gesture he had observed earlier, every slight or insult, was now met with quiet accountability. The crew had no choice but to acknowledge it, and the executives ensured that the lesson was enforced immediately. The cabin was no longer just a place of transit. It had become a stage where arrogance had met consequences, and quiet authority had triumphed. The lesson was clear. Disrespect, no matter how small or how seemingly justified in the moment, carries weight, and those who wield power lightly may find themselves humbled in unexpected ways. Engagement line. Comment below, what would you have done in his shoes? Would you stay calm like Steven or react differently? Passengers continued to murmur, some recording reactions on their phones, while others simply sat back, awestruck by the turn of events. The flight that had begun like any other had transformed into a moment of clarity and awe, a story of respect, humility, and the subtle yet undeniable power of presence. The moment of reckoning began immediately. Steven Seagal remained standing, calm and composed as the executives moved through the cabin, taking swift and decisive action. The first-class staff who had laughed at him, belittled him, and assumed their authority would go unquestioned were now the center of attention and scrutiny. The smug expressions they had worn just moments before had vanished, replaced by a mix of fear, embarrassment, and disbelief. Executives began addressing the crew one by one. Names were called. Positions were questioned. Mistakes were listed. The flight attendant who had initially denied Steven his seat trembled, unable to meet his gaze. She had thought she was in control, that her arrogance had gone unnoticed, but now every action, every slight, every careless word was being examined with precision. Your behavior was unacceptable, one executive said firmly, his voice carrying across the cabin. This level of disrespect will not be tolerated under any circumstances. He turned toward Steven Seagal, allowing the man to nod, acknowledging the correction without raising his voice or making a scene. His presence alone was enough to underscore the severity of the situation. Passengers watched in stunned silence. Some leaned forward, trying to take in every detail. A few discreetly recorded the proceedings, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary, a rare moment where arrogance was confronted, corrected, and consequences enforced in real time. Others simply stared, mouths slightly open, hearts racing with awe at the display of calm authority. Steven then addressed the executives directly, his tone measured but commanding. Reassign the positions of anyone who showed disrespect, he instructed. Terminate those whose actions were intentionally rude or condescending. This must be clear, arrogance has consequences and respect is not optional. Executives nodded, moving quickly to implement his instructions. Staff members who had once moved with pride now shuffled nervously, unsure of what awaited them. Some were reassigned to less visible roles, others were given stern warnings, and a few were asked to step off the plane entirely once it landed. The consequences were immediate and public, serving as a lesson not only to the staff but to every passenger who had witnessed the events unfold. Throughout the cabin, the reactions of the passengers were a mixture of awe, relief, and disbelief. Some whispered to each other, recounting the arrogance they had just seen punished. Others shook their heads, marveling at the quiet but undeniable authority of the man they had underestimated. Cameras discreetly recorded every moment, capturing the expressions of those who had once been confident, now humbled before the calm resolve of Steven Seagal. Even passengers seated further back felt the shift in energy. The plane, once filled with casual chatter and routine noise, had transformed into a stage for a powerful lesson in respect and humility. The subtle hum of the engines seemed to fade into the background as the focus of every eye was drawn to the actions taking place at the front. Steven remained composed throughout, a picture of calm authority. He did not raise his voice, did not shout, did not threaten. His presence alone conveyed a message stronger than words. Disrespect carries consequences, and arrogance is never overlooked when faced with quiet power and decisive action. As the executives worked to correct the situation, Passengers began to relax, some murmuring words of admiration. "That was incredible," one whispered to a friend. "He didn't yell, didn't fight, and still made sure they learned their lesson." Another nodded, saying, "That's respect in action. True power doesn't need to shout." The flight attendants who had behaved rudely were now silent, their confidence shattered. They moved through the cabin with a new awareness, careful with every step, every gesture, every word. The lesson had been delivered, and its impact was immediate and unmistakable. By the time the plane began its descent, the atmosphere had completely changed. There was a quiet respect in the cabin, an understanding that actions carry weight, and arrogance can be punished even in the most public of settings. Passengers returned to their seats, many still recording snippets of the events, others simply reflecting on what they had witnessed. Steven Seagal remained seated, calm as ever, eyes forward, observing but not interfering. The lesson was complete. The staff had learned humility. The passengers had witnessed authority in its most measured and effective form. And the plane, once filled with tension and whispers of mockery, was now quiet with the weight of a lesson no one would forget. It was clear to everyone who had been on board, arrogance has consequences. Disrespect is never without cost. And true authority, like that demonstrated by Steven Seagal, does not need to raise its voice to command attention or deliver justice. The plane finally touched down, its wheels meeting the tarmac with a quiet thud that echoed the resolution of an extraordinary journey. Passengers began to gather their belongings, stretching, whispering, and replaying the events that had just unfolded in their minds. What had started as a routine flight had become a masterclass in humility, respect, and the quiet but undeniable power of presence. Steven Seagal remained seated for a moment, observing the cabin one last time before rising to leave. He did not boast. He did not demand acknowledgement. His actions had spoken louder than any words could. Every passenger, every crew member, every observer on board had witnessed something far more impactful than a confrontation. They had witnessed a lesson in human decency delivered with precision and calm authority. Respect, he had shown, is not something you assume automatically. It is not tied to status, wealth, or reputation. It is earned, quietly, consistently, and through actions rather than titles. The first-class staff had believed their arrogance and smirks could go unnoticed. They had thought that power lay in belittling others, in flaunting authority over someone they underestimated. But true power, as Seagal demonstrated, is silent. It does not shout, it does not threaten. It simply exists, and when necessary it acts decisively. Passengers reflected on the lesson in their own ways. Some realized that arrogance is more dangerous than they had imagined. Others understood that humility is not weakness, and that those who underestimate quiet strength often find themselves humbled in ways they never expected. Cameras and phones had captured moments of shock, awe, and silent authority, but the real lesson was intangible. It was in the shift of energy, the change in behavior, and the collective realization that no one is above respect. Even the crew who had acted poorly were left with an indelible memory. Their previous confidence, built on the assumption that their authority was unchallengeable, had crumbled within minutes. Reassignments and reprimands were immediate, yes, but the deeper impact was psychological. They now understood, viscerally, that actions have consequences. Every smirk, every whispered insult, every belittling gesture carries weight, and someone, somewhere, may quietly decide it is time for accountability. Meanwhile, passengers who had been recording videos or observing quietly exchanged glances, nodding in unspoken agreement. The atmosphere in the cabin had transformed from tension and unease to a reflective, almost reverent calm. They had witnessed a rare event, the humbling of arrogance, the quiet enforcement of respect, and the demonstration that true authority does not require theatrics. As Steven Seagal stood to leave, he gave a slight nod to a few passengers who had maintained their composure throughout, those who had observed respectfully without interrupting or mocking. The acknowledgement was subtle but meaningful, a reminder that respect flows both ways. Power, when exercised with integrity, rewards humility and punishes hubris, not loudly or dramatically but decisively and fairly. The moral of the story was clear. No one should mock or belittle another, regardless of how insignificant they may appear. Even the most powerful people in any setting can quietly change the rules, correct injustices, and restore balance without raising their voice. True respect is earned, not assumed. True strength lies not in domination, but in the quiet, calculated assertion of authority when it matters most. For passengers, the experience would stay with them for a lifetime. They had been witnesses to a rare form of justice, one that was both immediate and instructive. The story would be told again and again, each retelling reinforcing the idea that humility is more than a virtue. It is a practical form of intelligence, a shield against unnecessary conflict and a gateway to influence. As the cabin emptied and Steven walked down the aisle toward the exit, the passengers felt the weight of what had occurred. They had seen arrogance dismantled, humility rewarded, and respect enforced without spectacle. The ordinary flight had transformed into an unforgettable lesson. Type respect if you believe manners and humility matter. Tell me where you're watching from. I want to thank everyone who stays humble and observes the world with patience and dignity. In the end, the lesson extended far beyond the plane. Every observer, every participant, every witness carried a reminder. Arrogance is temporary, respect is permanent, and true authority does not need to be loud. It is quiet, patient, and effective. And when it acts, it leaves an impact no one who underestimated it will ever forget. Passengers left the aircraft carrying more than just luggage. They carried a story, a lesson, and a reminder that respect and humility are the true markers of strength. And in that quiet, powerful way, Steven Seagal had reminded everyone that actions speak louder than words, that patience is a form of power, and that no one is ever above accountability.